The current level of conversation about reparations, particularly on the national stage, is probably greater than anything that might have been taking place in the United States since the Reconstruction era.
Reparations as a way to make amends for the atrocities of slavery and to reduce the persistent wealth gap has recently gained momentum.
$14 trillion in reparation is an appropriate statement.
Black Americans possess 2.6% of the nation's wealth, but make up 13% of the population.
That racial wealth gap is a starting place for any reparations program.
A number of states, towns, and institutions have begun to grapple with the idea. As of August 12, 142 Congress members have co-sponsored H.R. 40, the bill that establishes a commission to study reparations. That is compared to only 2 in 2014. Even Joe Biden has said he supports the bill, but a real program could be costly.
This hardly seems the time to burden the economy with more debt, more taxes. Essentially, what you want to do is stimulate economic growth for all our benefits.
This is not small money. This is $1 trillion that we're talking about, more or less. Separate social program for this entity that you've carved out, that you've called Black people. I'm against that.
The U.S. is far from a concrete national compensation plan. Still, months of racial justice protests push the concept to the center of the national debate. In the event that it becomes a reality, what would a potential reparations program look like? And can the U.S. afford it? Black Americans lag behind whites in almost every category of economic well-being. They are far less likely to be employed, own their home, inherit money, accumulate wealth, and earn as much as white counterparts. The median net worth of a white household is $171,000. For blacks, it's just a bit over $17,000.
There's the whole ecosystem of segregation having created the lack of opportunity ladders, whether it's through underfunded schools, over-policed neighborhoods. We have embedded residential home values in race. So your home is worth more if you live in a mostly white neighborhood.
The best we can do is, in fact, to erase racial wealth differences in the United States by building Black asset positions to a level that is similar to the average wealth that's held by white Americans.
What do we want? Reparations! When do we want it? Now!
Though reparations has been studied, practicality has often taken a backseat to morality. Scholars who have worked on calculating compensation don't always agree. For about 30 years, William Darity has discussed the rationale and design of reparations. Today, he says it will cost the United States government between $10 trillion and $12 trillion. To put that in perspective, in 2019, the US GDP was about $21.5 trillion.
The share of wealth in the possession of Black Americans ought to match, at least match, the share of the population.
A more conservative estimate looks at the 40 million acres that should have been allocated to the 4 million freed men. The present value of that land is about $1.5 to $2 trillion. If about 35 million Black Americans are eligible, the minimum estimate would amount to between $40,000 and $60,000 per person. Darity argues that as the culpable party, the government needs to foot the bill.
The federal government has the capacity to create new resources in this way. Congress could direct the Federal Reserve to create a fund of some sorts as well, either as a complement or as the entire basis for funding this project, especially since it can be conducted over the course of 10 years. But I think that the one thing that we have to be very careful about with any new federal expenditure program is what are the inflationary risks.
All government money has to come from somewhere else. Now, it can sort of borrow that money, essentially print it, which right now the interest rates are very low, but they're not going to always be. And we do have long-run obligations in terms like Social Security and Medicare that we're going to have to meet someday. And we're running up huge deficits and huge amounts of debt in order to deal with the COVID crisis. Given all of that, simply adding more debt on top of it doesn't strike me as being a particularly fiscally prudent course of action.
Inflation and the cost of adding to the national debt are two of the biggest barriers to extending or expanding federal programs. To avoid inflation, Darity proposes trust accounts, or some form of an endowment where the recipient can spend a percentage of the money on an annual basis and keep the rest in an interest-earning account.
The idea is that the amounts of those direct payments should be sufficient to eliminate racial wealth differences in the course of a decade. We think that the delivery of funds to individuals is the most precise and accurate way to address the wealth differential.
If wealth does not fall from the sky, it's not as if there exists a fixed amount of wealth that's simply there and we have to decide who has it. Wealth is created, wealth is generated. The real issue here are differences between the populations in the capacity to generate wealth. If you redistribute, you may have a short-term impact, but in the long run, unless the differences in these populations in their capacity to generate wealth, to start business, to effectively take risks, to save and accumulate within their families, unless those factors are addressed, the underlying structure will push you back into a situation of inequality again.
It can simply tax that money, in which case you're simply taking money out of the pockets of some people and putting it in pockets of other people. That's not increasing wealth at all. That is simply, now it will make some people better off who don't have savings and don't have financial assets today, but it's going to come at the expense of the economy as a whole.
Compensation programs can take many forms. In 1988, descendants of Japanese Americans forced into internment camps during World War II received $20,000 each. Germany has paid over $70 billion to more than 800,000 Holocaust victims. Reparations programs for descendants of slaves could adopt a single method or several at once. One example is baby bonds. While the idea won't replace reparations, Darrick Hamilton argues that they can act as a powerful complement. These accounts would be targeted at poor children and help them pay for college, buy a home, or start a business.
One is a retrospective economic and racial justice program to pay a debt and also close the racial wealth gap. And the other one is prospective in the sense that it ensures that in a race-conscious way, everyone will in perpetuity have access to capital, and it works towards mitigating concentrations in the future of wealth.
According to Hamilton, baby bonds would increase by a guaranteed annual rate of 2%, and the initial deposit would be between $25,000 and $60,000, depending on the financial situation of the child. One study argues the policy could decrease the racial wealth gap by more than tenfold.
It's based on the presumption that there are about 4 million babies born each year, and if you seeded every account at about $25,000, then 25 times 4 million, and then you add some infrastructure costs of running the program. So the baby bonds would cost less than $100 billion a year, and then one could talk about that in the scale of what we currently spend. So 100 billion is about 2% of federal expenditures now. It is much less than we spend with our tax policy on subsidizing the assets of the wealthy. So if one were to think about the cost of baby bonds, the scale of other asset expenditures, it pales in comparison.
This is sort of a precursor of a universal basic income in the sense that it's going to people regardless of qualifications. It may have some means testing to it. It may not, depending on how the program is actually played out.
The country has been discussing reparations one way or another since slavery officially ended in 1865. But the protests following George Floyd's killing have thrusted racial inequality to the forefront. According to a recent Reuters poll, 1 in 5 Americans support the idea that the country used taxpayer money to pay damages to descendants of slaves. A 2019 Gallup poll found that 29% are in favor of such a program. In that same survey, 16% of whites were in favor of cash payments.
The number has to be put in context because when Michael Dawson and Ravana Popov did a survey in the year 2000 about American attitudes towards reparations, they found that only 4% of white Americans were in favor of reparations for Black Americans. And so it does represent somewhat of a sea change from the proportion that existed in the year 2000. We also have evidence that close to half of millennials are actually in favor of reparations for Black Americans. We may be in a moment where the conversation can be pushed forward in a far more positive way.
If you want to tackle problems of disadvantage and social exclusion, don't do it in terms of race. I think that's very bad for the country. I think it's the wrong way to think about social obligation to each other. We're not tied to each other because we belong to these different racial groups.
Even if you don't care about justice for Black Americans, I think if you care about the soul of America, reparations will heal all of us.
Local efforts to fund reparations are starting to develop. Recently, the City Council of mostly white Asheville, North Carolina, voted to apologize for slavery and offer funding to help Black homeowners and businesses. Evanston, Illinois made a similar move in 2019, using tax proceeds from recreational cannabis sales to fund the program.
I can't be sure that even a more optimistic moment will actually translate into a full and comprehensive reparations program. But the present moment seems to afford more of an opportunity to move forward than any moment I've experienced in my lifetime.